Hey there. Welcome to this deep dive. We're really cracking open a specific, and let's be honest, sometimes tricky bit of contract law today.
hmm
Think of this as us working through it together, using your course materials as our guide,
Sounds good.
our focus. It's squarely on contracts in restraint of trade. What are they actually? Why does the law generally seem a bit suspicious of them?
Yeah, and why is that?
And the big question, under what very nary circumstances might they actually be enforced by a court?
It's a real balancing act, isn't it? That's the core of it. You've got freedom of contract. On one side, people should be able to agree to what they want.
Right.
But then you have the need for a competitive marketplace. And these restraint of trade clauses, they sit right in the middle of that tension.
Okay, so let's kick things off with the definition. Your course materials, they describe these as basically agreements where someone promises not to do certain types of work or trade.
Right. Refraining from something.
Yeah, often like the materials mentioned with the Bering case, the goal is really to prevent competition.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, this isn't always a whole separate contract.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes it's just, a single clause buried within a much larger agreement, like an employment contract maybe, or when someone sells their business.
Got it. So it could be hiding in the fine print.
It could be. But the starting point, the general rule, is actually quite clear.
Yeah.
The materials highlight this, referencing cases like Asia Works.
What's that?
Basically, that these contracts or these clauses are generally considered void, invalid,
Why?
because they go against that fundamental idea of a free and fair market based on competition. They restrict it.
Right. So the default is, nope, can't do that. It stifles competition. But there's always a button law, isn't there?
Usually, yes.
The course materials definitely emphasize there are exceptions, situations where a restraint might actually be enforceable.
That's correct. It's not an absolute ban.
So what's the key condition? What unlocks that exception?
The magic word is reasonableness. The party who wants to enforce the restraint, the one benefiting from it, has to prove it's reasonable.
Reasonable to whom?
Reasonable in two ways. Considering the specific interests of the parties involved in that contract, and reasonable in light of the broader public interest.
Okay, reasonableness. And how do courts figure out what's reasonable?
Well, the common law has developed a kind of framework, which you'll see detailed in the materials. It generally boils down to three key questions.
Okay, what are they?
First, does the restraint actually protect a legitimate interest of the person trying to enforce it? We call them the covenantee.
Legitimate interest. Got it. Second.
Second, is the restraint reasonable in its scope? We're talking duration, how long it lasts, geographical area, how wide it reaches, and subject matter, what specific activities it actually stops someone from doing.
Okay, scope. Makes sense. And the third?
Third, is it not contrary to the public interest? So even if it seems fair between the two parties, could it still harm the public somehow?
Right, that broader view.
And just a quick side note, particularly relevant in Singapore, you also have the Competition Act from 2004.
Ah,
That act prohibits agreements that significantly restrict competition. So, a restraint of trade clause could potentially fall foul of the act as well as these common law rules. There can be overlap.
okay, good point. Let's dig into those three common law tests then, because that seems to be where the real action is. First one, protecting a legitimate interest. What does legitimate actually mean here? It can't just be any interest, can it? What examples do the materials give?
Absolutely not just any interest. The courts are pretty strict. They can't simply be, I don't want competition.
Okay.
So if you sell a business, the classic legitimate interest is the goodwill.
Yeah.
The reputation, the customer connections you've built up. The
Yeah.
buyer needs to protect what they just paid for.
That makes sense. You bought the customer base, essentially.
Exactly. Now, in employment contracts, which is where we see these clauses a lot, the legitimate interest is typically about protecting things like genuine trade secrets.
Like a secret recipe or formula.
Could be. Or confidential client lists, specific trade contacts the employee got because of their job. The materials mention cases like Asia Business Forum, Lek Guinoy, Tan Kok Young Steve, that deal with this.
Okay, so specific confidential stuff.
Yes. And there's even an interesting point raised in the Man Financial case mentioned in the materials.
Oh, yeah.
It suggests that maybe, just maybe, maintaining a stable, trained workforce could itself be a legitimate interest, protectable perhaps by a clause stopping ex-employees from poaching their former colleagues.
Ah, a non-solicitation of employees clause. Interesting.
The developing area, potentially.
Okay, so that's what can be legitimate.
Right.
What about the flip side? What's definitely not a legitimate interest, according to the materials? You mentioned just stopping competition.
Right. That's the big one, just wanting to prevent a talented former employee from competing against you. That's generally not enough. Cases like Herbert Morris and Buckman Laboratories are key here.
And what about the skills someone learns on the job? If I become a brilliant programmer while working for company X, can they stop me using those programming skills at company Y?
Generally, no. The law sees those general skills and knowledge you acquire through experience as yours to take with you. They're part of your personal toolkit now, not the property of the former employer. Protecting against that is seen as just trying to stifle competition or, limit employee mobility unfairly.
And the Stratex Systems case in the materials seems to really hammer this home, doesn't it? What happened there?
Yes, Stratec is a great illustration. You had former employees leave and join a competitor, and Stratec sued them based on a restraint clause.
Okay.
The court basically followed that Buckman Laboratories principle. They said, look, an employer can't just use these clauses to insulate themselves from ordinary competition from people who used to work for them.
So what did Stratec need to show?
They needed to point to a specific, protectable interest, like proving these employees had access to highly sensitive trade secrets or were walking away with key client relationships they were about to exploit.
And they couldn't.
Apparently not, based on the summary. Since they couldn't demonstrate that specific legitimate interest, the court saw the clause as basically just an attempt to stop the ex-employees competing, full stop.
And therefore?
Invalid.
Uh,
It underlines that critical point. You absolutely need that specific protectable interest. Just wanting less competition isn't good enough.
Crystal clear. Okay, so hurdle 1, legitimate interest. Let's say you've got one. Hurdle 2 is reasonableness in scope.
Exactly. Scope.
How do courts evaluate this? You mentioned duration, geography, and subject matter.
That's right. They look at all three. Is the time period too long? Is the geographical area too wide? Are the activities being restricted too broad?
And if any one of those is excessive?
Then the restraint is likely unreasonable and therefore void. It has to be tailored. If it goes further than genuinely necessary to protect that legitimate interest you've identified, it fails.
Can you give an example from the materials?
Sure. Think about duration. If you need, say, 6 months for a client connection to weaken after an employee leaves, then a 3-year restraint is probably going to look unreasonable.
Right.
Or geography. The Mason case is a classic, mentioned in the materials. A canvasser worked a small area, but the restraint covered a massive territory, like 1,000 times bigger.
Clearly overkill.
Totally unreasonable.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessary to protect the employer's actual business interest in the small area the person worked. Same idea with a clause trying to prevent someone giving advice anywhere in the world, usually too broad, unless the business and the interests being protected are genuinely global in that specific context.
So it has to match the reality of the interest being protected.
Precisely. It must go no further than necessary. That's the principle, echoed in cases like Man Financial.
And subject matter, what does that mean?
It means the type of activity being restricted has to relate closely to what the person actually did. The HT-SRL case points this out. You can't stop a former software engineer from working in, say, marketing if they never did marketing for you. The restriction has to align with the job they did and the interest you're protecting.
Got it. It needs to be relevant. Now, the CLAS Medical Center case seems to tie a lot of this scope stuff together. Can you walk us through that one based on the materials?
Yeah, CLAS is really instructive. You had Dr. N, an established aesthetic doctor involved in a joint venture. He leaves, there's a restraint clause, and he sets up nearby. CLAS sues.
Okay, so the court looks at the clause's scope.
They examined geography first. The clause covered all of Singapore. The court said, okay, given Dr. Ng's practice, that seemed reasonable.
Right, maybe patients came from all over?
Possibly. Then duration. It was for 3 years. The court also found this reasonable. Interestingly, they noted Dr. Ng was quite senior and had apparently proposed the 3-year period himself during negotiations.
That probably didn't help his argument that it was unreasonable later.
Likely not. But then they hit a snag with the subject matter.
What was the problem there?
The clause restricted him from practicing aesthetic medicine, and this was the crucial part. All procedures and treatment as understood by aesthetic medicine.
And that second part was too much.
The court thought so. They felt all procedures was wider than necessary to protect Elia's specific interests from the joint venture. It was just too broad a restriction on his ability to practice.
So did the whole clause fail then?
No, and this is where it gets interesting and links to another concept, severance. The court decided it could actually just cut out the offending words, the "and all procedures" part.
Like taking a blue pencil to it.
Exactly. They severed the unreasonable part, leaving the rest of the clause, the reasonable parts about duration and geography, and the core activity intact and enforceable.
So severance can sometimes save a clause if only part of it is bad?
Precisely. If the bad part can be neatly removed without fundamentally changing the deal or making the remaining part nonsensical, the court might do it. It's often called the blue pencil test.
Fascinating. Okay, so that's legitimate interest and reasonable scope, the final hurdle, not contrary to public interest.
Right.
The third check.
What does this involve? It sounds a bit vague.
It's basically a backstop. Even if a deal seems perfectly reasonable between the two parties involved, the court can still say no if enforcing it would actually harm the public.
Harm the public? How?
Usually by significantly reducing competition in a particular market or field. The materials mention the Asia polyurethane case in this context. If enforcing a restraint would, say, leave one town with only one specialist doctor, or massively drive up prices because there's no competition, that could be deemed contrary to the public interest.
So it's about the broader economic or social impact.
Yes. It asks, does this private agreement have negative consequences for the wider community? The Esso Petroleum case in the materials seems relevant here, even though it's about solace agreements, right? Tying garages to one supplier.
That's a good example, yes. The facts involved a garage owner agreeing to buy fuel only from Esso. One agreement was for about 4.5 years. Another, tied to a mortgage, was for 21 years.
Big difference in time.
Huge. And the House of Lords thought so too. They found the shorter tie-in was probably okay, a reasonable commercial arrangement.
But the 21-year one?
Unreasonable. And a key reason cited was the public interest. Tying up a petrol station, preventing it from selling other brands, or potentially offering lower prices for over 2 decades. That significantly restricted competition in that local area, harming consumers.
So the public interest aspect can be decisive, especially with long-term restrictions.
It absolutely can. It's a reminder that contract law doesn't operate in a vacuum. The courts consider the wider context.
Okay, so let's quickly summarize the effect then. If a restraint is found to be unreasonable, fails one of those 3 tests, what happens?
Well, as the materials state, the general rule for illegal contracts, or contracts with the illegal clauses like an unenforceable restraint of trade, is that they are void. Meaning the offending clause, at least, cannot be enforced by either party. You can't sue on it.
But you mentioned severance.
Exactly. That's the important qualification we saw with CLAs. If the unreasonable part, maybe the duration is too long or the geography too wide, can be neatly blue penciled out without wrecking the rest of the clause or the contract, the court might sever the bad bit and enforce the reasonable remainder.
So it's not always all or nothing.
Not always, no. Severance offers a potential middle ground.
Okay, let's try and pull the main threads together from our discussion based on the course materials.
Sure. So first, restraint of trade agreements or clauses are designed to limit competition. That's their purpose.
Right.
Second, the general rule is they're void because the law generally likes a competition. Third, they can be enforced, but only if the party seeking enforcement proves 3 things. They protect a legitimate interest, like goodwill, trade secrets, maybe a stable workforce, but not just stopping competition or use of general skills.
Okay.
They are reasonable in scope, time, area, activities restricted, no wider than necessary.
Got it.
And they are not contrary to the public interest.
The 3 hurdles.
The 3 hurdles. We also touched on how the Competition Act can be relevant here too.
Yes.
And finally, if a clause is void, it's generally unenforceable. But the doctrine of severance might allow a court to remove just the bad part and save the rest.
Excellent summary. That really maps it out. Now, building on all that, here's something maybe for you, the listener, to think about.
Okay.
We talked about reasonableness in time and geography. But think about how incredibly fast industries change today. Technology, job roles, remote work, everything moves so quickly.
Yeah, the pace of change is immense.
So, how might that constant flux affect how a court today views what's a reasonable time period? Or even a reasonable geographical scope, especially with remote work and global markets? Does that traditional concept of reasonableness need to evolve significantly for our modern, digital, constantly shifting economy? Something to chew on.
That's a really good question. Definitely food for thought.
Happy studying until the next class.